Hi there, I'm Victoria Peat and welcome along to this video tutorial where I will be showing you how to sew the letter M from my miniature foundation paper piecing alphabet. It's a PDF pattern that's available to purchase on my website, and you get all the characters of the alphabet plus 7 additional special characters. So today we're going to have a look at the letter M. The letter M is a difficult rating of 2 out of 3 stars. It is sewn together in one section, but there are 11 sections, 11 different pieces, and there are some smaller pieces and some diagonals, which is why I've categorized it as a 2 out of 3 stars. So what I've done is I have roughly cut out the pattern piece. You can see the dotted line I've cut just to the outside of that. We'll trim later on, and I have pre-folded all of the lines because that's how I like to do my foundation paper piecing. In terms of fabrics, we are working with a navy fabric and a pink fabric. The pink is going to be making up the main part of the letter, and the navy is the background fabric. So to start off with, we're going to sew, we're going to prepare piece number 1 and we're going to sew it to piece number 2. Number 1 is a pink piece, the main colour of your pattern. So I'm going to place a bit of glue on the underside behind piece number 1, which is just here. Let me just double check. A little bit of fabric glue, and then I'm going to place my pattern piece on the wrong side of the fabric, and I need to make sure that I have got enough fabric around the outside. I'm using an add an 1/8 ruler, so I need to make sure that I'm placing this so that the fabric covers or sits underneath piece number 1 and allows an 1/8 of an inch all the way around. And I'm going to be sewing on to piece number 2 next. So I'm just going to place it over here. I'm then going to fold back the pattern piece between piece number 1 and piece number 2, and then I'm going to trim off this excess fabric, but making sure that I leave myself with a seam allowance. So you don't trim right up against to the paper, we're just leaving that 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. We then need to take this to our next fabric, which is my navy, and I need to make sure that piece number 2, which is this triangle here on the back, if I try and draw for you where that is on the back, it comes down like this. And you can see this more clearly at home, it's just for the video. This is piece number 2, so we need a piece of fabric to sit underneath here, but we need to make sure that it's big enough for here, plus your seam allowance around the outside. If that makes some sense. So I'm going to place that with raw edges matching, and you can see that this is a triangular piece, but I'm still just matching up against a raw edge. I'll take that over to the machine. I'm going to flip the paper over. I'm going to sew along the line between piece number 1 and piece number 2. I've got a shorter stitch length of, I've got 1.2 on my machine. Press the needle in, press the foot down, and I'm going to sew along the line between 1 and 2. Trim the fabric. Sorry, trim the thread. So I've now sewn between piece number 1 and piece number 2. I'm going to take it to the iron, and I'm going to press and flip back that fabric along that line that I've just sewn. But you just need to make sure, because you've got this extra fabric, that you're pulling directly back from that line of stitching. Try not to distort your fabric, which can be easy to do when you're sewing smaller pieces. Fingers and thumbs today. Pull back along the line of stitching. Don't pull so that you distort, but you just don't want an extra little fold appearing. Okay, so that's piece number 1 and piece number 2. Piece number 3 is actually at the other end of piece number 1. So what I'm going to do is, to get rid of this excess here, I'm going to look at piece number 2 on its own, and I've just got to think that round piece number 2 I need enough seam allowance, either the add an 1/8 or add a 1/4 around the outside. So I'm going to fold back against this line and then I can trim off this excess background fabric that I have. This way, and then I can just fold back. Oh, beg your pardon, I just haven't quite gone far enough. Okay, so that's blue left over from another time. So back round the other side, I now need to take off this excess of the pink between piece number 1 and piece number 3. So I'm going to fold back along the line between 1 and 3. And where your excess fabric may differ from mine, because you'll be dealing with different pieces of fabric, trim using my add an 1/8 ruler along there, and I'm also just going to trim off down the bottom here, and then that releases all of that extra fabric. So now between the line between 1 and 3, I'd folded back and I'd trimmed off that seam allowance. Now I don't need the next piece to go all the way along this seam line, because the pattern piece, and I'll use a slightly darker pen this time, the little piece that we're doing is only piece number 3, and you'll be able to see on your pattern that it's quite little. I'm just going to hold up to the light so I can just mark it on for you, here to here. The size of piece number 3 is only quite little, so we need fabric to cover that, and then your 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch, just visually think about how big that's going to be. Can you see that? Not that way. So your piece of fabric needs to be that size, not the size of the piece of paper, the rest of the pattern piece. Place that against a nice straight edge here. And I don't need to, so you could actually move this up to the left, so this the piece of fabric underneath doesn't need to extend to cover all of this white piece of paper. It's just that little section that I've shown you on here. Flip my paper over, and I'm going to sew just between the line between 1 and 3. Just checking that nothing's moved. Bring my needle down. Further. I'm going to sew on that line. Okay, so I've sewn that. I'll press it flat and flip it back. And when you're pressing, use just the end of your iron. This is where a mini iron is really useful, because you could just press that little bit. You don't want to distort anything else that you've got waiting. Okay. So now we need to do piece number 4. Piece number 4 is one of the upright sections of the letter M. So we're going to trim away this navy. We're going to fold against the line between 3 and 4. And we're going to trim the rest of that pink off. And the background fabric. I'm just making sure all the time that you're leaving yourself with a little seam allowance so that you can sew your next piece on. So piece number 4 is background, main colour that I'm using, which is the pink. So it needs to be big enough for that dotty section for piece number 4 and my 1/8 of an inch around the sides. Place that on top, over to the machine, making sure that my raw edges are aligned, flip over the paper and then sew between the line between, well, it's between 3 and 4, but it also crosses along the side of piece number 1. So I've sewn along this line here that goes past number 1 and past number 3, and then I'm going to press and flip that over. Okay. Get my hand out of the way. I'm going to press and flip. Press it flat, and then along that line. Clover also do a little tiny iron. That's useful when doing tiny foundation paper piecing. Or you might prefer to use a roller or a finger press, but I much prefer being able to press with the iron. Right, so we've got pieces 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 5 looks really skinny on the pattern piece, but actually if you look, you also need a piece of fabric that's going to extend into this seam allowance. So first of all, I'm going to trim this pink fabric off. So I'm going to fold back along the line between 4 and 5, use my add an 1/8 ruler. And trim. And number 5, have we got? Not quite enough. I'm not going to. I would ordinarily use this, but actually this bit on the edge has got the selvage on, so I'm going to save that for another piece. I'll use a larger square of fabric. So you can see here I've got this bit of pink here. This I will trim when I come to sew piece 11 on the bottom. I'll fold along that line and I'll trim off the bottoms of all of those. So I'm just ignoring that for the time being. Just really focus on the two pieces that you're sewing together. Okay. Machine. Oh, you can see that that's just moved, so I'm going to reposition those. Flip the paper over. So just sewn along the line between 4 and 5. So between 4 and 5, and I'm going to press and flip. Okay, so there's your M starting to come together. So from this side, I'm going to now trim off just outside of my paper pattern piece, because this is piece number 5 on the side, and that gets that out of the way. Okay. So then I can use that in a moment. So on this side, we've done 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We're coming back over to this side, which is 6, which is a longer piece, and I need my pink for that. I fold back along the line. This line actually runs parallel, or not quite parallel, because it's a bit of a funny angle, alongside piece number 1 and piece number 2. I'm going to just trim off this excess pink from earlier. Now the piece we're doing on this one is slightly angled at each end. Don't worry about that. Just think about your fabric and make sure that the fabric's big enough to cover that, plus your seam allowance around the outside. Let's see. So that's long enough. Lining up the raw edges. If in doubt, always go for a bigger piece of fabric on the underside, the piece that you're joining. If in doubt, always just go for a bigger piece. Just placing my presser foot down, and I'm just trying to make sure that this solid line, the stitching line, is running up the middle of my presser foot. Start with my needle down, and so. I'm using a 1.2 stitch length. And that's that line. I'm going to press that. So that's that piece. Sorry, I just needed a new piece of pink fabric. So that's that piece sewn in. We're now going to trim the seam allowances on that one. So that's your other diagonal part, and then we're going to sew in some background. So here, what I'm going to do, if I just show you here, what I'm going to do is I've got piece number 6 that I've just sewn, which is this pink background. Next I need to sew piece number 7, but I'm just going to trim the back of the fabric along the outside between 6 and 8 as well. Can you see? I'll try and focus on that. Not quite. Sorry, that's not focusing terribly well. But I'm just going to trim the seam allowances against the line between 6 and 7, but also between 6 and 8, because that will just release and get rid of this extra fabric. So I can put that on one side. But I just need to do this diagonal here to get the right angle. Just accidentally moved my fabric. Okay, so now I've got that angle. So from the top you can see how this is not a straight cut, it's cut at a slight angle, but that's because I've just followed the lines, folding back along the lines and trimming with the add an 1/8 ruler. So piece number 7 is back to the navy. So I'll fold along here. And it doesn't need to go along all the way to the end, because you can see on the pattern piece that the majority here is actually piece number 11 and the seam allowance. Let's see. Just going to give that a little press because that's got a fold in it that's not quite right. That's better. Back along 7. And got just a little bit of room on here for that to go. So we don't need the fabric to go all the way, so I could probably come a little bit to the left. So remember that piece 11, we're not worrying about that, it's just piece number 7 for the time being. Take that over to the machine. Check that nothing has folded under. And we're just doing the line between 6 and 7. Press foot down, needle in. Oh, just sorry. The camera. Sewn the line between 6 and 7, and I've just stopped just when I've got into where piece number 8 is. So give that a press. That's a press in. Okay. Nicely. Next piece is going to be another one of the uprights from the pink, which is piece number 8. So I'm going to fold back along that line, which was number 8, and then I will cut and release the extra blue fabric. And to be honest, I probably won't use that because most of that is selvage, so I'm going to bin that. But it is worth keeping these smaller pieces as you go along, because when you're doing smaller foundation paper piecing, then there are little bits, and that's quite useful. But that one here, because I've cut into, there's little cuts in this, I wouldn't use that for this piece number 8, even though you could probably fit that in that section. I wouldn't want to accidentally encroach onto where I've trimmed this fabric previously. So I'll go with a fresh, larger piece, not too big, not too unwieldy. And place those raw edges. And so. Just go a little bit with. Oh, I beg your pardon, I didn't change the camera. Rubbish. Fail, fail. Okay, so I've just sewed along here between the line for number 8, between the 7 and the 8. Camera directing fail. Okay, so now I'm going to trim off this excess. I'll trim along the line between 8 and 9, and then I'm going to just trim roughly on the outside edge. So the letter M, Maureen, actually there's a lady, Maureen, and she helped so much with my testing for these letters. She was an absolute superstar. Fabulous. Okay, so, or it could be for mum. Be nice, personalise a little tote bag or something for your mum, or a project bag. Okay, so I've got piece number 8. So you've got your 2 uprights, your 2 diagonal sections for your M. Now we need to sew, as we have done with the navy on this side, piece number 9 goes on the other side. One more press. It's just bouncing up a little bit. Right, so that's been trimmed. We need to place that raw edge up against a raw edge, straight edge on your larger piece. And we're going to sew between 8 and 9. And this time, I'll change the camera for you so you can see. Ta-da! Look at that. I've got to press 2 buttons and I've only pressed 1. Here we go. So I'm lining up the solid line with the middle of my presser foot, and just making sure that my needle's dropping down in the right place, not too far from the start of the line. Press and flip. And give it another press. Okay. Now from this side we're going to trim, because this piece number 9 is next to the edge of the block, so you need to allow for the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So just remember that even though you are sewing, you may be using an add an 1/8 ruler. When it comes to these outside edges, use the dotted lines as your guide to make sure that you've got enough to sew this to something else, because you want to be able to sew it to another letter or another part of a block or some sashing or something. And obviously we work with a 1/4 inch seam allowance in patchwork and quilting. So even though if you are using an add an 1/8 ruler, just bear that in mind. Okay, so last 2 pieces are piece number 10 and piece number 11, and they're at the top and the bottom. I'll fold back against the line for number 10 and trim off the tops of these other sections or pieces that we've sewn, because you don't want all of this sitting inside your block. Trim these off, and now we have a nice straight edge to place against a straight edge on our piece of fabric. I'm going to go up here because that one was cut haphazardly, let's say. Over to the machine. And this one I am sewing all the way along through the seam allowance, because this piece number 10 is at the top, and I'm just sewing all the way through, extending those lines. And I'm going to do the same thing on piece number 11. I'm going to extend all the way through. But we will press, flip and double press. trim outside of this line for the seam allowance on the outside edge of the block. Okay. And then we're going to do the same thing for piece number 11 that we did for piece number 10. Cut back along 11. Trim off these excess pieces. Okay, so we've just got this one last piece, and I'm going to pop that on the straight edge of this fabric, making sure that the fabric's big enough on the underside to fully sit on the underside of. And the raw edges are still matching. Press it down. And so all the way up to or through those dotted lines on the outside edge. Okay. And press that one, flip it back and trim. Just roughly trim that off. Okay, so that's roughly trimmed. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim up to the dotted line so that we've got a perfectly rectangular piece. So I've got my larger acrylic ruler and I've got an old blade in an old handle that I'm happy to cut through paper. The handle is broken so the blade won't pop in, which is why I'm popping the blade facing away from me in case of mishap. Distributing my weight evenly, because you'll feel if you've done any of the easier blocks or the blocks that have got less pieces in them, they're much flatter. When you've pieced things that are more complicated, it's a lot more bulky underneath. So that's why I find it easier to use a larger ruler so that I can spread out my hand and it will really hold that paper, your finished block, in place. Oh, didn't do that one straight. Okay, so there's your little M. Super sweet. There we go. I'll show you that. So there is your M. It's 1.5 inches wide by 2 inches tall, and it's from my Miniature Alphabet foundation paper piecing pattern, which is here. Come on. There it is. So you've got all your letters of the alphabet plus 7 additional characters. Have a look on YouTube. Do subscribe because I am posting video tutorials for every single one of the characters so that if you get stuck, you can watch them back, you can replay, pause them. In case you get stuck, you might be new to foundation paper piecing. If you're wondering the tools that I use, I've got a few here today, but I've got a video on that as well. But if you get stuck, drop me a line and I will help out where I can. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you again next time. Cheerio.